Hey guys, Spudknocker here, as always, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm just wanted to fly a very relaxing little flight around the Persian Gulf map in my new F-16 and just hang out and have some fun. And I thought I'd have a bit of a discussion. As a history major and someone who majored in history with a specialty in aviation history, I get asked all the time, why is aviation history important? And today I thought we'd have a bit of a discussion about that as we fly around and have a little fun, maybe get in a little bombing practice in our new F-16. We're also in a very cool new F-16A Nets skin that's available for downloading on the ED website in the user file section. We've got a cold and dark F-15C Kef over there next to us, and we've got an AI wingman over there who's going to join us in an F-16C skin for the 1st Jet Squadron, as well as another cold and dark F-15 over there. So let's go ahead and hop in the cockpit, and we'll start our taxi out, and we'll start our discussion as well. Alright, so in the F-16, I like to turn off these bars here on the side that show the trend of our airspeed and altitude. I just don't think they're very useful and are very distracting while flying, so we're going to turn them off. So that's that, and we'll go ahead and start our taxi and be ready to go. We've got our nose wheel steering turned on. First, before that, let's make sure our controls are good to go. I was a little bit worried about maybe the configuration of my controls for a second there, but we're good to go. So we'll just taxi on out to the runway here. Like I said, it's just wanted a kind of a relaxing, fun flight here, just to kind of get the DCS mojo back. So, like I said earlier, discussion topic for today for this fun little flight, whoop, looks like a wingy is following us, is going to in fact be aviation history and why it matters. Aviation history itself is, of course, a rather new study when it comes to the very, very long tradition of keeping historical written records, which goes back thousands of years to the first cave paintings, which depict events, and to kind of the more modern history, an idea of history kind of invented by Socrates and other kind of deep Greek thinkers back a couple thousand years ago now. Definitely before the Common Era, or which is kind of the more politically correct way of saying BC versus AD, before Christ, after Christ, Common Era, and before Common Era, so BCE versus BC. And so, like I said, aviation history is a very, very new form of history. I've always been interested in aviation history growing up in a family of military pilots, as well as commercial pilots. I don't know if anyone else has this issue besides me, but I feel like I can't get my head just right in the F-16. It always feels like I'm looking too high up, and I find myself resetting my track IR all the time. I don't know if anyone else has that issue. We'll wait for our wingy here, but as I was saying, aviation history, in the grand scheme of things, is an incredibly new kind of history, and a new discipline of the study of history that is just very new, I guess you could say, in a lot of ways. Now, see our wingman's coming in here, and honestly, it is only as old as airplanes are old, and that just simply goes back to 1911, when the Wright brothers took their first flight in Carolina. And so that is seriously not very long in terms of the historical record, in terms of the length of time our planet's been around, the universe has been around, that humanity has been writing down and keeping historical records. It is a teeny tiny distance. And so it's not a very well documented and not a very well studied part of history, but I still think it's an incredibly important part of history. And once I get airborne here, we'll continue on with talking about why I think it's so important. So let's go ahead and punch it into full afterburner here. Let's start dancing on the rudder pedals a little bit. I know you're not supposed to, but because sims are just so sensitive, I have to turn off nose wheel steering the minute I get going on the runway, or else the likelihood of me flying off the side and flipping my jet over on its back is incredibly, incredibly high. Alright, so here we go, blasting off into the sky. And we're heading out towards waypoint 1, of course. I still think the drag values and things here in the DCS F-16 still need some work. It seems like we can get going very, very, very fast. Very, very easily. So we're airborne now, so why don't we go ahead and fly out towards waypoint 2, steer point 2. And like I said, we're just going for a very nice little relaxed flight here as we discuss our discussion topic of why aviation history matters. So a little bit more background on my topic here is I have always been interested in history, love reading about history, watching videos, making videos, reading books, reading articles, anything that has to do with history, I'm all about it. And so of course when I got to university, I wanted to major in history. But when you get into university-style history classes, things can be a bit disappointing in some ways. And I want to preface, before I get into this, by saying I find myself to be a rather liberal person. I wouldn't consider myself to be a conservative in any way, shape, or form. But in a lot of ways, academic history in American universities has changed a lot from what you would think of being the classical version of history classes. Since the 1960s, with the rise of feminism and progressive ideas, there have been two forms of history that's come out of that. You have the idea of the great man theory of history, as well as the bottom-up theory of history. And so let's delve into what those are. The great man theory of history is more of a top-down version of history, and that is looking at great figures in history, whether that is the aforementioned Socrates, or George Washington, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, Richard Nixon, any one of those very famous, very high-level figures in history. Whereas the bottom-up version of history kind of looks at the everyday man, woman, and child throughout the ages. And when I got to university, I found this to be incredibly boring history. Bottom-up history is incredibly boring. To me, it's not interesting learning about what the average family in the Middle Ages ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, if they even had those at all. And it's not interesting to me to learn what the everyday woman in the United States on the home front was doing during World War II. There's incredibly important reasons for people studying and understanding those types of things, but to me, it's just not my cup of tea, personally. We're just enjoying the sights here in Dubai. Why don't we tell our wingman to bring it in a little closer? Flight formation. I think I used the wrong radio, but we'll see. Yep. Flight formation. Finger four. There we go. There we go. Obviously, I know it's weird to have an Israeli skin here in the Arab Gulf states, but we'll make it work. I love the Israeli skins. And so, like as I was saying, to me that kind of history and that reading about that stuff is just incredibly boring and incredibly tedious. I don't find it interesting at all. I would much rather be learning about what Washington's plan at Valley Forge was, far more than the average person in any period of time, anywhere. So, as a result, I went to a pretty cool and flexible university where I could sort of finagle a way to study what I wanted to study through a bunch of self-study and things. And I wrote a series of papers about aviation history and convinced my professors to let me study aviation history and make that be kind of my specialty and really major in aviation history, as opposed to the university's regular historical curriculum. And so, as I got into that, it really hit me as to why aviation history is important. And to kind of appease the professors and chair people at the university, I kind of came at it from the stance of, and I do believe this, it's not just total BS here, but I do believe that aviation history is somewhere in between the great man theory of history and the top or bottom up version of history that is very popular in most universities right now. And I believe that's true because obviously there are more pilots, aviators, fighter pilots, attack pilots, commercial pilots, bush pilots, any, aviators in general. Ooh, that's a little bright out there. Jeez, gotta put on my shades. Then there are generals, presidents, dictators, premiers, any of these kind of stereotypical great men. You can't see it right now, but I'm making air quotes around great men. And so you get kind of this middle ground between the bottom up and the top down versions of history. And a lot of people out there know nothing about aviation, and as a result know nothing about aviation history. And so being someone who is so fanatical about airplanes, flying, all this stuff, and just love it so much that I knew this was what I gotta study and help bring some awareness to it. And so kind of my rationale was, obviously there's more pilots around than there are generals. And so I used the Cold War as a case study. And really you can look at the entire Cold War through the lens of aviation history and get a very, very rich, very, very detailed picture of the Cold War through the lens of aviation history. The idea here is that, let's take a slice of some population. Let's say post-1956 Suez Crisis Egypt. Let's say now they've become a Soviet client state and they're receiving shipments of MiGs, most notably MiG-17s, MiG-15 UTI trainers, MiG-19 farmers, and later on MiG-21 fish beds. Now, who in the Egyptian society do you send to fly those brand new Soviet jets? Of course, you're going to want to send the guys you already have that are pilots, but it's the upper strata of society, and usually pilots come from middle class, upper middle class to high class people, which in of itself is an interesting idea because aviation requires education. It requires the means to acquire that education, and it requires a means to use that education to then move on and learn and use those study skills to study the skills you need for aviation. And we're just kind of cruising around Dubai here. I'm really digging my discussion here, so I'm not really doing too much in terms of flying a jet. We should probably look at our gas, which I think we're good to go on gas. So why don't we go ahead and flip this guy over to our external tanks. And they're already empty. Oh no, that's the center tank. Okay, cool. And back to what I was saying, is so let's go back to Egypt, post-1956 Suez Crisis. They send to the Soviet Union to learn how to fly, that upper strata of Egyptian society. And who is that upper strata of Egyptian society post-1956 Suez Crisis? For the most part, they're men. They are between the ages of roughly 25 to maybe, we could stretch it a little bit and say maybe 45. They are educated, of course, and let's think about Egypt in between 1956 and 1960, and that class of people, that 25 to 45-year-old demographic of men. Odds are they would probably have been educated at universities in Western Europe. If not, they've been educated by British probably British teachers within Egypt at Egyptian universities. And so you kind of get this idea of they've grown up and been well educated, whether in Europe or within Egypt itself. And with that Western mindset, you get the ideas of nationalism, these kinds of things that they will apply to thinking to themselves, well, I should go fly these jets to support Egypt and support Egyptian nationalism. And that, of course, aligns them with the ideas that Gamal Nasser brought to Egypt in wanting to turn Egypt into the model independent Arabian Arab state. And so you can get all this super interesting, intimate details about who the pilots were, and why they flew, and why they were picked to fly, based on, through the lens of aviation history. And so you get this very interesting depiction of the motivation of different people. Oh, shit, we're still in Cat 1. We gotta be in Cat 3. Whoops. Sorry about that for any F-16 aficionados out there. And so you get this very interesting cross-section of society. And when, in terms of the Cold War, and the idea of the Soviet Union being this communist, ideal communist society, you get pilots who are highly educated and come from the upper caste of society, and that kind of goes against the idea of communism, where everyone is completely and totally equal all the time, no matter what. And so it's very interesting in that way. And it flies against a lot of the ideas that someone like Gamal Nasser would have about equality and nationalism within Egypt itself. And so you get this idea of, like I said, upper class people, whereas we need that special person to go learn how to fly those brand new MiG-19s, MiG-17s, and MiG-21s. You can pull any guy out of an Egyptian cotton field or a Vietnamese rice paddy and give him an AK-47, and with some minimal training, maybe a couple days at most, turn him into an infantryman. That's very, very easy, but it takes that education, those immense resources, financial, educational, and military resources to create a fighter pilot, and turn those Egyptian guys into fresco farmer and fishbed pilots. And so you could get this very interesting look at different countries and how they work and who is flying the jets, based on just looking at the country through the lens of aviation history. I know I'm kind of rambling a bit, but that's kind of the idea of this video in general, is just to ramble and have a discussion about it, because it's a topic that really means a lot to me, and something I've poured my heart into for many, many years. So why don't we go ahead and fly away from Dubai, and let's go visit the mountains out there at the tip of the Omani Peninsula. I'm out here by the Strait of Hormuz. And so why don't we kind of shift over from, instead of just looking at the pilots, let's take a look at the aircraft themselves. Aircraft have been and are the pinnacle of humanity's scientific, engineering, design achievements. That aviation is the lead up to, of course, the most notable and gigantic and significant human achievement of all time, which is, of course, landing human beings on the moon. The men who went to the moon, the vast majority of them were pilots. The spacecraft were designed by aerospace companies. Fighter jets like this F-16C Block 50 that we're flying here are expensive, incredible, just amazing pieces of technology, and just represent the pinnacle of what humanity can build and put out there. And so when you look at aviation through that lens, it makes sense that you can then track geopolitics through the lens of aviation history, and you can track the sales of aircraft to different countries and track the geopolitical relationship between those countries through the sale and acquisition of military and civil aircraft. And I think that in no other circumstance is this more obvious than when you look at the Imperial Iranian Air Force and its subsequent turning into the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force in the 1979-ish time frame during the Islamic Revolution. Most people in the United States do not understand and really can't understand, even people who lived through the 1979 period in the United States still can't grasp the fact that the United States was that close of an ally of Iran for that long. American pilots flew and died in Iranian aircraft, flying against the Soviets, flying super top secret reconnaissance missions and air defense probing missions into southern Soviet Union from Iran. Operation Ibex and Operation Dark Gene are a very good example of these operations, which American pilots risked their lives along with their Iranian brethren to glean information about the Soviet Union, specifically the air defenses of the southern Soviet Union. And so that's why the Iranians received the most advanced versions of the F-4 Phantom that were out there. A lot of people look at the Iranians' acquisition of F-4Ds and think, oh, it's just an old F-4D. It's not even Echo version. But their F-4Ds were incredibly specialized and important versions of the F-4D that were actually able, some of the first aircraft able to drop laser-guided bombs through the, I'm forgetting the actual military designation here, but through the Zot box, which is actually a box that sits in the Rio cockpit or the WSO cockpit, and is like a handheld, almost binoculars that you can laze a target with and buddy laze LGBs from another aircraft. The Iranians actually used the Zot box and GBU-10s to quite good effect against Iraqi bridges during the Iran-Iraq War. And so, obviously, they were the only country out there to receive F-14s. And it just goes to show the super close relationship between the United States and Imperial Iran pre the Islamic Revolution. And so military aircraft are a special case study in that they are this pinnacle of human achievement in a lot of ways, technologically, engineering, design, like all these things I listed before, but they're also portable, extremely portable. Now, other countries do build and sell warships to other countries, but that is in a far smaller and less extensive way than other countries build and export aircraft. Obviously, aircraft are literally built to be transportable, and so thus it makes more sense for them to be transportable. And so you have, interesting exceptions to the rule, like France building two assault ships that are very similar to our Tarawa class, called the Mistral class, that were originally going to be built and sent to and bought by the Russians, which were then sent off to Egypt after the Russians, went off the rails and did bad stuff, starting in the 2010-ish time frame. And so you do, of course, have exceptions to the rules here, but aircraft are far easier to view this lens, through this lens of geopolitics. And so it's just a very, very, very interesting and complex topic. And so I feel you can view all of the Cold War through the lens of aviation history. And in what way did American and Soviet Union and the Soviet Union directly confront each other in any other way but in the realm of aviation? You can always say, oh yeah, well, the Vietnamese had AK-47s and the United States was carrying around their M14s and M16s. Well, an infantryman's rifle is an infantryman's rifle. They're honestly really not all that different. And I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for that statement. And I do very much enjoy reading about the history and engineering behind firearms and watching channels such as Ian McCollum's Forgotten Weapons channel, which I find to be incredibly interesting. However, it's just firearms are not that big of a technological step. The the M16 and AK-47, I would argue, yes, they're different. They fire different bullets. They're made out of different materials, but in the end, they do the exact same thing. They both do it pretty darn well, and both you can be trained to use either one in just a few days for a very short time by very uneducated people who don't need that much coddling to learn how to use these weapons. Whereas the same cannot be said for a fighter jet. Obviously, a fighter jet requires all these things that we discussed earlier: education, the means, the resources, all these kinds of things. And so that's why I say that the only really confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, or Western, NATO, as a larger example, would be through aviation. And we can see that in the direct confrontation between American F-86 Sabres and MiG-15s in the, I'm not going to say the NATO reporting name, because unfortunately that now has a very negative connotation here in 2019. But, in which Russian advisors flew and fought and were killed and killed Americans in the skies of North Korea from bases within the safe zone across the Yalu River in China. And I would say the confrontation between American warplanes, the best and the most advanced there were, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, F-4 Phantoms, A-6 Intruders, A-7 Corsairs, and Russian SA-2 and SA-6 missile systems and SA-3 missile systems in the North Vietnamese inventory, as well as the basically the same inventory of aircraft: F-4 Phantoms, A-4 Skyhawks, some more European aircraft like Mirages and things like that, facing down Soviet SAM systems during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, is a much more direct competition than I would say between the technological advances of both the superpowers. Then I would say would be the competition between two different combat service rifles. And so you have this very, very interesting way to look through the Cold War from a very different lens that is kind of all-encompassing. It takes into account a lot of different parts of historical analysis and the historical thought, and as well as the historical kind of record of the Cold War, and shows it between the Soviet Union and the US through the lens of aviation. And I think that's just an incredibly interesting and important way to go about looking at things. So we're just kind of flying through the mountains, just enjoying the sights. It's really nice sometimes to just hop into DCS World and enjoy the beautiful sights that are in DCS World. I know, of course, there's lots of issues and problems with the F-16, but sometimes you just gotta sit back and enjoy it. How are we doing on gas? Total, we got a little more than 8,000 pounds total. We're totally fine there. Now, the flight model of the F-16 definitely feels interesting. It's not exactly what I would expect. I'm not sure where our wingman went. Did we drag him into a mountain? I guess not. There he is. Now, besides just the geopolitical aspects of aviation history also touches on this kind of midpoint between the great man and the bottom-up theory of history in its cultural aspects. A lot of Western cultural ideas and things and attitudes are influenced greatly by aviation, whether people know that or don't. Like one very good example that I always surprise people with is the term the full 9 yards, the kind of the idea that you went all the way, you went 100%, 110%, and you accomplished your goal, you went the full 9 yards. That is a very deeply rooted aviation-centric saying. Now, what that refers to is the 50 caliber ammunition belts used in World War II fighters, typically the P-40, P-51, P-38, and P-47. Those ammunition belts for the 50 caliber M2 machine guns were 9 yards long. And so if a pilot came home and said he went the full 9 yards, that means he gave it his all, used up all his ammunition, gave it his all in combat, and he made it back safe and accomplished his goal, and hopefully accomplished his mission. And so that's a very deeply rooted aviation saying that nobody knows about, the origins to that saying. And as well as you go back into kind of the idea of, not so much these days, but back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, lesser extent into the 60s as we start to get into Vietnam War, anti-war sentiment, but certainly during World War I and very much through the 1950s, you get this idea of the pilot being the new knight. Everyone was kind of drawn to the idea of a knight in the sky, someone who's handsome and educated and has the white scarf around his neck as he flies into combat. Kind of the idea of the lone knight going to duel the enemy. And this idea is very much represented in propaganda from the era, whether it's World War I propaganda showing off different units like the Royal Flying Corps, the Lafayette Escadrille, and of course during World War II, as you get into aviation being even more an important component of military strategy and military campaigns. You get almost every World War II propaganda poster out there that was made in the United States for buying war bonds, for keeping secrets. All these things were very much rooted in aviation, with aviation taking a very prominent place. It's because people thought of aviation as being a romantic, beautiful, noble aspect of war. Of course, we all know from studying real war in the sky that it was very much anything but romantic, and with especially in B-17 bombers being shot up by interceptors, flak, and bringing home wounded and dead crewmen, and all these things that were really quite horrific and not romantic. We still see this idea of it being beautiful and romantic, and this very much a uplifting kind of idea for the people on the home front who wanted someone to look up to during the dark days of World War II. And so that's another very important cultural aspect of studying and understanding aviation history. And I would say that as you move forward through the 60s and 70s, a lot of that romanticism and kind of uplifting nature of aviation was lost in military aviation due to the idea and sentiment of the Yankee air pirate, this idea of American pilots dropping bombs on civilians in Vietnam. Obviously, we know now that a lot of that stuff was obviously Soviet propaganda, and the Soviets definitely played upon the anti-war sentiment in the United States. And of course, you have the horrific incident of American actress Jane Fonda going into North Vietnam and showing sentiment for the enemy, and flying directly into the face of American aviators, especially, who were forced to halt the bombing while she was there comforting the enemy. And so a lot of that kind of romanticism of aviation was transferred more to the civil side, with Pan Am and these kinds of very glamorous types of air travel and things, but of course started to fade over time. So as I believe that the romanticism that it deals with the historical aspect of aviation kind of transferred more to the civilian side of aviation through the 60s and 70s. Of course, now that's kind of lost. I think that 9/11 was kind of the turning point for that, and people not really having any romantic feelings left unless you're very much into aviation post 9/11. And so I believe that, especially here in the United States, aviation and aviation history is very, very important to know about and learn about because of the deep-rooted historical emphasis on aviation here in the United States, and that is because we invented aviation, we got to the moon, we put a man on the moon, and we are at the pinnacle of aviation in the world. Alright, so let's go and fly out towards Greater Tomb Island, and we'll go ahead and drop our bombs and have a little fun that way. Turn on our RWR just in case, and we'll go ahead and go into air-to-ground mode. Yeah, we'll drop in CCIP, we'll drop in pairs. Yeah, we're in nose-tail mode. We'll go ahead and flip her over into Master Arm On. I'll get a little practice dropping bombs in, why not? Let's go to HSD over here. Just kind of figure out how to use the HSD in the F-16. It's kind of weird, but we're doing the best we can. Alright, we're out of fuel on our external tanks, and we're at about 7,000 total. So we'll probably head up to Greater Tomb here, and then we'll head home. Oh Jesus, 43 miles away. Oh man. Alright, well, we'll just keep on flying out here, and I think we'll be good on gas. Maybe we'll bring up increase the altitude a little bit, get to some thinner air, that'll help. And there's our wingman hanging out over there. Pretty darn cool. The external model of the F-16 definitely looks really nice. One of the reasons I believe that aviation history is so not known in the United States, in the Western world. I think it's probably a little bit better in the UK, from what I've read and what I've talked to people, because they have such an intimate connection to the Battle of Britain, which is, of course, extremely aviation-centric. Literally a battle fought for the survival of their country, fought basically only in the air. Of course, on the sea and in lots of espionage, but mostly, for the most part, up in the air, which is very interesting. And but in the Western world, I think that we're very disconnected from it, because as time goes on and as aircraft get more complex, more expensive, moving from civilian airplanes being DC-3s to 787s, from P-51 Mustangs to F-16 Fighting Falcons. Things get more expensive, they get more complicated, and thus you have a pyramid shape when it comes to the amount of people who are in aviation, who are pilots, who are ground crewmen, who are involved in aviation intimately, because there's just fewer airplanes out there. In one aspect, there are more airplanes out there than there were, but in another aspect, there are fewer airplanes out there than there were, which obviously sounds like an oxymoron, but I believe is a good way to describe it. And thus, it requires more training, more resources, all of these kinds of things to be intimately involved in aviation. Let's see. And so it creates that pyramid effect, and so less people are involved in it, therefore less people know anything about aviation, which is kind of a bummer. News agencies, anytime a military aircraft is shown, they call it an F-22. anytime there's a story about a civilian aircraft, they call it a 747 or a jumbo jet. You know, it's just kind of these stereotypical names, and nobody cares or has the wherewithal to go in and understand more about it, because it's such a complex and unapproachable topic. And that's why DCS World itself is pretty amazing that it's even a product, because it's so inaccessible unless you know a lot about aviation or you have a lot of time on your hands to learn a lot. DCS World is going to be completely out of the grasp of the majority of people in the Western world. And that's why it's interesting that it can survive as a product. There are enough people out there spending money on DCS World. I think DCS World definitely has quite a few whales who buy everything that has to do with DCS World, and that's totally fine. I'm definitely one of those. Alright, so let's set up for some good bombing runs here. We don't want to totally make a fool of ourselves. Alright, so we got our commands. Gotta turn this on, of course. Manual. Let's see. Alright, cool. We're good to go there. And so because of that, aviation history itself is incredibly inaccessible. It's a very inaccessible topic for 99% of the population out there. And to the point where I think I wrote a paper about the Condor Legion in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and talked to a lot of art majors and other history majors about this paper. And a lot of people are of the idea and have the idea in their head that the bombing of Guernica was, of course, a Nazi atrocity committed to completely annihilate a city. Whereas when you go in and read the first-hand accounts from pilots and crew members that were on the raid in Guernica, that are translated into English out there, for consumption and things, is that in reality what happened in Guernica is it was an incredibly unfortunate mistake in which German crew members were sent out on a raid to bomb a crossroads to prevent a Republican armored column from reaching the front lines in a spot that was very lightly defended by the Spanish nationalists. And so you had this raid going out to bomb this crossroads, and through a combination of smoke as a result of kind of the fog of war on the battlefield, as well as meteorological conditions, in the fact that there were multiple different cloud layers, some scattered, some broken, and some overcast, the German bombers, which were made up of a mix of HS-51 biplane fighters, earlier models of the HE-111 Heinkel bomber, kind of the stereotypical Battle of Britain bomber, as well as Junkers Ju-87s that were converted to the bomber role rather than the transport role, were searching for this crossroads, and through their bomb sights, looking down on the target area, found a crossroad, and of course dropped their weapons on it, thinking that was their target, but in reality it ended up being a crossroads in the center of the town of Guernica, which of course led to the atrocity and horrific bombing of Guernica, which is of course enshrined in Pablo Picasso's famous painting of the same name. But for people who haven't read those first-hand accounts, which are incredibly technical first-hand accounts written by pilots and crew members, that and you don't know what a target looks like in bad weather through a crude World War II or pre-World War II era bomb site, people aren't going to understand how that mistake could have been made. And a lot of these first-hand accounts showed that pilots and crew members, upon hearing what actually happened when they landed back at their bases, were overcome by what they had done, and many of them ended up getting physically sick on the ramp as they were told what had happened. And this was, of course, this idea of what happened in the aftermath led to the Nazis' idea of using terror bombing as a tactic. But Guernica was kind of the first one that wasn't necessarily the test that most people think of, but more or less a accidental finding out of what terror bombing can do. And so a lot of people who are intimately connected with the art world and know of the painting Guernica and are intimately connected with history and studying history don't understand that aspect of the bombing of Guernica because they don't understand the technical details hidden within the first-hand accounts from the pilots and crew members who were there. And so, of course, there's going to be some controversy there as to were those accounts edited? Were they subject to changing by propagandists, things like that, of course. And there's always going to be back and forth questions to that, and I'm 100% aware of that. But it's a very interesting idea. So let's go ahead and find a target here. It looks like we've got a silkworm site down there. Let's go ahead and swoop on in and drop some of our bombs. I'm a little bit worried about gas here at this point, so hopefully that's no problem. We'll go ahead and drop our bombs on the airfield here. Why not? Ooh, yep, I'm definitely a little bit worried about gas. I'm going to start pumping out some flares because I'm a bit worried about man pads that may be down there. Oh, yep, there goes a man pad. Yeehaw. Those things are usually either very stupid or absolute laser beams here in DCS world. So, understanding so I guess that whole Guernica story that I talk about, the understanding of a very technical and unapproachable history that is aviation history can lead to a lot more nuanced understanding, or at least add to the historical record or debate about something that is so complex and well known and so horrific as the bombing of Guernica was. And so because that history is so complex and so unapproachable to 99% of the population, including 99% of most historians, that part of the topic is not debated and not known by many people. And so this is another reason why I think aviation history is important and should be studied, is because aviation has such a huge impact on the way war is fought, the way war is won, the way people are transported across the globe so quickly nowadays, and ideas and things that but it's such an inaccessible topic that people really need to know about it in order to fully understand what happened. I think another reason why I made this video was I'm super excited about the release of Modern Warfare coming out later this week. And of course, a video game is meant to be fun and meant to appeal to the lowest common denominator in terms of knowledge, and especially a game like Call of Duty. But it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. In one of these trailers, it showed a Predator drone dropping a GBU-12. This GBU-12 that they dropped was painted blue, which means it's an inert GBU-12, which it kind of rubbed me the wrong way in the fact that the makers of the game, spending millions of dollars to make this game, were so ignorant of aviation and stuff about military aviation that they couldn't be bothered to go and look and research that a blue GBU-12 is in fact a inert GBU-12. They probably just looked at a picture of a Predator drone sitting on the tarmac at an air show on a static display with an inert GBU-12 stuck on the wing and said, hey look, that looks like a cool laser guided bomb, we'll throw that into the game. So that was kind of an interesting thing, that it really just shows even a game company who specializes in making games about the military is ignorant of how aviation works and different aspects of aviation. So that was another kind of motivation for this video of why aviation history and aviation knowledge is important. Let's see, let's look at our fuel. We got 5,000. I think we're pretty good. And so it's an interesting topic, and it's something, like I said, it's so inaccessible that if you haven't grown up around it, you haven't studied it, you haven't known anything about it in the past, it's very, very hard to get into. And like I said, that kind of goes full circle around the DCS world, because DCS world to the average bystander is incredibly inaccessible. You really can't pick up DCS world and learn how to fly the DCS F-14, F-16, or FA-18 without some sort of previous aviation knowledge, even if you read every page of the manual and every part and play through every training mission you can possibly find, or comes with the module. There's no way. Unless you've read books, watched documentaries, you may be able to press the buttons to drop a bomb in your DCS F-18 or F-16 or F-14, but you won't be able to fly effectively and survivably and all these things without some sort of previous knowledge about military aviation, which is interesting. And it really just shows how little people know about aviation and in Western society. I think that things are a bit more... I think more people know about aviation and how it works and all these kinds of things in Russia. And I think that's why we see so many aviation simulators coming out of Russia, be it IL-2 or DCS, is because a lot of Russian universities have very big aviation programs in terms of aviation, aerospace engineering, and things like that, but then the actual Russian economy doesn't have that many aerospace jobs, and so a lot of people end up studying that but getting jobs in a completely different area, or simply doing making simulators, I guess, which is good for us, but is an interesting side effect of that. I believe that a better understanding of aviation history and how aviation works would be incredibly beneficial for a lot of people. People who debate and go over and over and over again in circles about the Arab-Israeli conflict could seriously benefit from a education in aviation history. Let's see here. Alright, there we go. In order to better understand that conflict, because the Arab-Israeli conflict is really a conflict like most others that were won in the air, and that is incredibly true, especially when you look at the 1967 Six-Day War, as well as the 1982 Lebanon War. Less to an extent, it was almost lost in the air by the Israelis in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So it just really goes to show how important an understanding of aviation history is and should be to these people, but in reality they just don't understand. And military aviation is such a huge part of Israeli culture. I wrote a paper a while back about the almost mythical, pseudo-religious significance of the F-15 in Israeli society, and how a lot of people believe that the F-15, both at the time as well as now, believe that the F-15 was this may sound dramatic, but a gift from God, a a savior to Israel, a machine that's a protector of Israel, and is something that, and is a jet that is very much an important part of Israeli society. Whereas Americans think that F-15s are cool, Israelis credit the F-15 for being a savior of Israel and being a bringer of peace to Israel, because it is so much better, and is and was so much better than anything the Arabs had available to them in the aviation realm. And this, of course, was shown over and over again during the Operation Mole Cricket 19 in the 1982 Lebanon War, in which Israeli F-15s absolutely trounced the Syrian Air Force and showed that MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and MiG-25s were simply no match for well-flown and well-equipped Israeli F-15 squadrons. I believe that American lawmakers, especially, could really use and benefit from a strong education in aviation technology and history in order to better facilitate better decision making in terms of regulating aviation, the debate over general aviation, whether or not it's a good thing, which of course I'm going to say it is a 100% good thing and a necessary thing, not only for the US, but for the aviation industries of the world, with the US really being, besides Australia and to a lesser extent Russia, being the only places in the world where people can come to learn how to fly airplanes and then go home to their home countries and fly for their home country's airlines, or even their air forces. American politicians could greatly benefit from increased good decision making in regards to our military, general aviation, the regulation of the aviation industry, the rules put in place for companies like Boeing, like McDonnell Douglas is part of Boeing, like Lockheed Martin, all these different companies and things that people would really, really benefit from our representatives being educated in this topic. Of course, I'm sure a lot of people could say that our lawmakers could use an education in a lot of things, whether that's healthcare, firearms, aviation, automobile, any kind of facet of society that requires regulation. And I guess that's kind of a wrap-up of why I think it's important. And I know this is kind of a rant, wouldn't say a rant, but I would say more of a discussion video, and an interesting discussion topic, because I think it's just something that a lot of people know quite literally nothing about. I think this is very obvious. I think that another contributing factor to people knowing nothing about aviation is the invention of the jetway. If you don't know, the jetway is the tunnel you walk down from your cozy little terminal in the airport to your not so cozy, very uncomfortable seat within the airplane. And so before the jetway, people had to walk out into the elements, whether it's hot and sunny or cold and snowy, to get to the airplane and walk up the steps into the airplane. Thus, people would see that the aircraft is in fact this gigantic piece of machinery. They see ground technicians doing things to the aircraft. They see hydraulic fluid leaking out of the aircraft, oil leaking down out of the aircraft, smell the fumes of fuelers fueling the aircraft, looking at inspectors inspecting things, potentially fixing parts of the aircraft, pilots doing pre-flights, and they could really see, holy crap, this is what we're getting into. This is dangerous. These people, whether they're ground crew or airmen, are showing the utmost of professionalism in the pride they take in their job and the pride they take in the safety of their passengers. Whereas now, you walk down that tunnel, you're in your sweatpants, you walk down that tunnel, you get into your seat, you put on your headphones, and you watch a stupid movie. And you see none of that. And so that really degrades people's respect for aviation. And if people's respect for aviation is degraded, then why would they feel motivated to learn about aviation? And so that's kind of a contributing factor, in my opinion, to people not knowing anything about aviation for the majority of society. And why I think it's a bit of a problem. So we're going to go ahead and head back here to Al Minhad Air Base and complete what appears to be a crosswind landing. So last part definitely got a bit ranty, but it's still part of the discussion as to why aviation history is important. Alright, coming back up on Al Minhad Air Base. Should be right up here. It's kind of stuck in the haze up here. I think it gets a little bit too orange once we get down into the haze down here, but that's okay. I wish there was a way to kind of tweak the value of that color. But for the most part, it's really not bad at all. I definitely like the effect that the desert sand gives you once you're high up in the air. I can feel a little bit of turbulence down here. The air base. You can see just the faint outline of the runway, and we'll line up on it and fly a nice overhead pattern. Hopefully we don't smash our F-16's wimpy little landing gear on the ramp here. I guess a lot of people think that when I talk to people, like when it comes to people like who are involved in debates on the Arab-Israeli conflict and things like this, people often say, well, the aviation history side is irrelevant, it doesn't matter. I believe that couldn't be further from the truth, because if you want to actually debate a topic which is so important and has so many factors to it, you want to know as much about the topic as possible. And like I said, the story of the Israeli Arab conflict is so intimately intertwined with aviation history. They're, in my opinion, wholly inseparable. And to a lot of people, that really just doesn't click. And in fact, a lot of people don't know this, that, well, we're going to go ahead and turn off the drift. There we go. A lot of people don't know that Israel's F-16s came to them because Iran ordered a batch of 160 F-16As, and during the fall of the Shah, those F-16s were yet to be delivered, aside from some tooling for spare parts building and things like that, as well as some safety equipment and like things like pilot ladders and stuff. And so thus those F-16s had nowhere to go anymore, and so they were given as an option to Israel. Similarly, diplomatic efforts in regards to the Arab-Israeli conflict are intimately tied to aviation. in the fact that Israel only got its F-15s as a result of conceding the Sinai back to Egypt. And part of the F-15 deal was Israel will give back the buffer that they had between themselves and Egypt. Oh shit. Not good. But in exchange, Israel would get the most, arguably the most powerful fighter jet in the world in the F-15, and thus give it a severe military advantage. Oh my god, this crosswind is horrific. I literally cannot fathom why I suck at landings and simulators so badly. Oh jeez. Oh my god. Oh crap. I can't believe that the landing gear did not collapse. Wow, I really need to get better at this, and probably need to practice without a crosswind for a bit.
Pontiac 1-1, Dark Star, Bra 354, Fort 110 at 12,000 knots.
So there are so many things that are very, very inexplicable, most people don't know, are very much tied to aviation and are very much relevant to pertinent topics of our day, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, that people don't know are tied to aviation in very, very intimate ways. The landing gear looked fine, and that is a complete and total surprise. And we can see that this was an F-16A that was in fact used during the Operation Mole Cricket 19, during the 1982 Lebanon War, in which it shot down quite a few Syrian aircraft as well as a single Iraqi aircraft. So I hope you guys liked and found this discussion video interesting. I know that I find the topic just incredibly interesting. I know that some people probably don't find the topic interesting at all and don't care and just want to fly their F-16 in DCS and don't really care, and that's fine too. But for me personally, that's why I include aviation history stuff in my videos, is because it's incredibly interesting and incredibly pertinent, as well as it gives you guys a why something is, why do we do something in the cockpit, which helps you understand the how. If you're just told how to do something, at least in my opinion, that's great, but I tend to lose that pretty quickly. I like to have more of a context as to why we do something, and that definitely helps me understand and grasp something a little bit better, as well as learn how to do it better. Well, I know you're low on fuel. Head home. Jeez, buddy. Flights. Go to return
Flight,
bus.
RTB. Copy.
Okay, well, he's got his wheels down, so freaking land. I think I broke something on the landing gear because we're definitely pulling to the right, but our wind is definitely coming from a left to right from this vantage point as well. So our big vertical stabilizer back there is probably acting like a nice big sail for us. And we can see those two F-15s sleeping on the ramp over here that we started out next to. So once again, I apologize for that horrific landing. That was scary. I'm not even sure how I'm able to taxi at this point, but we did the best we could. And I've just been so busy lately that I try to maximize my time when I'm here in DCS World in terms of flying and having fun as well as making videos. And so sometimes things like learning how to land the F-16 falls through the cracks because not many people want to watch me practice landing as much as they want to watch me show you guys how to drop bombs, fire missiles, all this cool stuff with explodiness. So that kind of gives you guys a bit of a rationale as to my thinking behind why aviation history is so important and why I studied it and why I continue to study it and continue to write papers on it and all these kinds of things. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please give us a like and a subscribe. If you like my channel, please consider donating on Patreon. Every bit of support that you guys gives me definitely helps keep the channel going. And with YouTube being very strange with their algorithm and how they award advertising revenue and stuff, YouTube really doesn't make much money, and certainly not enough. Is he going around? What in the world? We're doing a touch and go? And he's going around. Because the wind is so ridiculous. So yeah, as I was saying, Patreon just really helps to keep the channel going and helps make videos like this. So thanks a lot, guys, and fly safe.